Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. Today's episode tackles the legal issues surrounding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What's the current status of Nord Stream 2, and what are the implications of this? Are the sanctions imposed by the EU and the UK watertight, or are there some loopholes? And what about European utilities that have subsidiaries or business activities in Russia? Could the EU unilaterally decide to completely cut energy supplies from Moscow, and what would happen if it were to do so? Helping me, Richard Sverrisson, to grapple with these key questions is Anna Stanic of E&A Law. A warm welcome, Anna. Good to have you back on the pod.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me.
To start off, Anna, how do you view this invasion or the events as they've sort of continued over the last 2 or 3 weeks?
Well, I think for me, as an energy lawyer, I've concentrated primarily on looking at the statements made by the European Union when it announced that it wanted to reduce its energy dependency on Russia by 2/3 already by the end of this year, and then the entire sort of way in which it proposes to do so. That's sort of been the key issue to grapple with for me in the last few weeks.
So in terms of where alternative supplies could come from?
Well, where the alternative supplies would come from, how do you reduce something by 2/3 and not by 100%? Because presumably if you start reducing something by 2/3, the other side will say, well, we just reduced it by 100%. We don't hold all the levers of this kind of in this relation. So, announcing something like that has repercussions of their own, as we've already seen in the market. So yes. So looking at that and trying to unpick it has been very important, because obviously if we get it wrong, we get the whole of not only our move to energy transition completely wrong, but also our economic future wrong. Because if we can't secure what we announced to secure, then there's a huge risk.
Do you think this is then a sort of very ambitious move, or is it achievable in such a short space of time?
I don't think it's achievable. And there's two things. Obviously, the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies has gone through and sort of unpicked the figures and has sort of come to a position where, the EU could secure about 30 BCM of new LNG at assuming we could pay for it by the end of this year. There's a huge debate on whether we could reduce our gas consumption by 38 BCM at the same time. There's talk about consumers turning their thermostats down by one degree, and how much that would bring. But there's much more serious issues. As I say, if we can't achieve what we set out to achieve from a purely supply perspective, or even a demand perspective, that's one thing which I think they show. The second thing that nobody's really talked about is what would be the cost of us doing this. Could we actually afford this? We are already seeing most of our industry, and certainly our agriculture, not being able to survive even the current prices. If we were to go and try to outbid the Asian markets to try to secure the 30 BCM or the 50 BCM that they're saying that we would have to secure by the end of this year, can our industry remain competitive? Can they even afford it? We've seen already demonstrations in places like Ireland of farmers who simply say that they can't afford the energy prices. They can't afford to rear the pork, the pigs, and if that then has as a consequence the domino effect that we simply don't have the supply of food, then that's a serious concern. So, and then ultimately, as a lawyer, I step back from all of that and I ask myself, okay, assuming that we could afford it, which is a big question that I don't think we can, assuming that we could get the supplies and that we could reduce our demand by 38 BCM, and that we could, I don't know from where, between now and November now, inject 90% effectively, which 90% of storage in the EU, which means 90 BCM between, and given that it's, I think, around 30, 40 BCM now, it's another 50 BCM that we need. Assuming we could do all of that, can we actually legally do this? And the answer, I think, to other than for contracts that expire at the end of this year, which I understand are some Polish contracts, all other contracts would require gas buyers to actually breach the terms of their contract, and that would obviously open them up for arbitrations. Who's going to pay them to breach their contracts? Alternatively, and who is going to be the 2/3 that breach their contracts? How is this going to be organized? And if it's not 2/3, if it's 100% on the basis of an introduction of sanctions that would effectively then provide the gas companies with at least temporary protection from claims on the basis that sanctions prohibit them from making payments under contracts, and that clearly would have to apply to all 100% of gas supplies. So, those are the kind of legal conundrums that needed to be thought through.
Absolutely. When
this kind of an aspirational statements have been made, because obviously they have ripple effects in the market.
Yeah, absolutely, and deep, underlying consequences. But I think, and if I can just ask you if we can delve a little bit more into what you've just raised here. Now, for example, the contracts that companies will have with Gazprom, is it how easy is it just to exit those? I mean, you can't just sort of rip them up, can you?
Well, it's not. I mean, it's not. You cannot exit them just because you decide that you want to exit them. Unless they are about to expire, then you can't invoke force majeure in these kind of circumstances because you're choosing to voluntarily terminate them. And there's an argument that's being made that by the Russians now demanding that the payments be made in rubles, that this could be a basis of saying that the breach is being made by the Russian side and therefore gives an opportunity to the other side to terminate the contracts. We have to see. I'm not that clear on exactly what Putin is demanding that the companies do. On the one, on the reportings that I've seen in certain places, it would suggest that he is saying that companies have to open accounts with Gazprom Bank and deposit their euro or US dollar payments or whatever payments the gas is being denominated in under their own contract in that currency, and that then there will be a conversion of that amount into rubles. That will be done by Gazprom Bank, and then that rubles will be transferred to Gazprom. If that is the case, then there's no breach because the payment is made in the currency that's being denominated under the contract. The key will be what will be the ruble exchange, and whether Gazprom would be turning around and saying you haven't paid enough because the euro ruble exchange rate is different to the one you think it is. But ultimately, the payment under the contracts are not in rubles, provided that the buyers are paying it in the currency of denomination. Then there's no breach. So then the question is, how do you get out of these contracts? My understanding is that there's numbers of buyers, including municipalities in certain Western European countries, that are considering terminating the contracts in full knowledge that they will be breaching those contracts. My understanding is that the ministries of that's not a Western country are trying to advise the politicians that it is extremely unwise to terminate them. But as a person in one of those, the ministry has told me, there's little common sense. So even though they have yet to find alternative sources of gas supply, there's a possibility that certain municipalities and potentially energy companies will simply terminate contracts for the supply of gas, open themselves to legal claims, and potentially opening themselves to a position where there will simply be no gas supplies in those specific areas, leading to shutdown of industry.
So that's like the worst scenario possible then, in a way. Everybody loses.
Well, I mean, the seriousness of the situation, I think, was made very clear by the CEO of BASF, the world's largest chemical group, who has repeatedly rejected calls for any kind of import ban of gas, saying that this move would be totally irresponsible and it would throw the German economy, but obviously not just the German economy. There would be a domino effect that would affect all other economies in the EU that are highly dependent on the German economy, and of course other countries that in themselves are highly dependent on gas, into what he says is that would be the biggest crisis since the end of World War II.
I mean, I think several key German economists and leading business figures have come out and said the same, Anna. But do you think, if I can go back to the deal that was announced with Gazprom Bank, and so that, non-Russian firms would pay in euros and then the bank will transfer it or exchange it into rubles, is this a way for both sides to sort of save face as well?
Well, I mean, the German government, the German economic minister has basically, it seems to me, rejected this possibility. I don't know whether he looked into it and then rejected it, or whether he will now look into it more carefully. And as I say, I don't know fully. There's different reportings of what exactly is being required by Putin. But what I see and what I suspect is the reason for Putin doing this, and in a way, how the sanctions are helping strengthen the position of Putin, is that he's effectively now finding a way to have money arrive in Russia. Up until now, most of the trades and most of the payments were not made into Russia. They were paid into bank accounts of different companies, including Gazprom and other affiliates or other intermediaries that had bank accounts throughout the European Union or the UK. Now that there is a potential of them being sanctioned, or that there is already sanctions in place, that is no longer possible. So what he is now securing is I don't know to what extent, but I would imagine that it's to a large extent for monies that were previously held in foreign bank accounts to come to Russia, and that this is the main reason for him doing so.
I mean, there's also the issue of, companies like Gazprom Germania and Gazprom Marketing and Trading. I mean, what do you, we're seeing noises that the German network regulator is going to take over Gazprom Germania. So this is all, it's a very rapid situation. It's a very fast moving situation, Anna. But we discussed before Christmas, sort of in December, about Nord Stream 2. Now, that seems to be completely dead in the water now, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. So we saw on the 22nd of February that the certification process was entirely frozen, and that the situation of the security and the impending invasion that happened 2 days later was used as a basis to freeze the certification. And obviously what has happened since then is, with the introduction of the sanctions, is that lawyers are no longer able to advise Nord Stream 2. So they have they've all basically been asked to put pen and paper and down, and the actual case, the PCA has advised that the case is suspended. The Nord Stream 2's case against the European Union, pursuant to the Energy Charter Treaty, is for the time being suspended. But I mean, just to put things in perspective, I mean, there has been quite a lot of discussion in the legal community about the fact that lawyers are prohibited from representing Russia and Russian-related companies, especially the ones on the sanctions list, in any shape or form. And this raises the issue of rule of law and basic tenets of legal representation. which obviously, no matter how gruesome a crime someone has committed or a war crime, they have so far been entitled to representation.
And you say this is, at the moment, lawyers can't represent any Russian companies. So this is basically in breach of, sort of long-standing legal principles.
Yes. So these are quite complicated issues now to address.
Absolutely. I mean, I can certainly see there could be, for instance, maybe a set of legal claims made against the decision, the German government, for example, for stopping the certification process. Could we expect that to come in months or years' time?
Well, I mean, they could be brought. Well, they can't be brought by any in terms of Nord Stream 2, because it's Gazprom and it's on the list. It certainly cannot be brought by any German lawyer or any European lawyer. So it would be Russian lawyers who would be bringing the cases, which I assume do not have rights of audience. I mean, I don't know how the German courts work and whether they can appear as Russian lawyers there, but presumably they could. But the point of the thing is that its lawyers until now are unable to represent them. And in fact, they are no longer representing them. Gazprom has disinstructed all those lawyers, also because its accounts are blocked. So how can it cannot even pay for the legal fees or court fees for that matter.
Absolutely. It's an absolute minefield. But then what about the sanctions, Anna? The sanctions, are they completely watertight? I mean, is it impossible for a country to import Russian coal? Because the way I understand it, it's more about the registration of the vessel rather than the actual, the contents of the vessel.
Well, I mean, there is an exception. So there has so far not been an intention to stop. And this is where the things become complex in terms of going back to the announcements of how do you reduce something by 2/3 rather than 100%. Presumably, once you start breaching contractual terms or introducing sanctions, then they would apply across the board to everyone. You couldn't just say, well, in certain countries we have sanctions and in others we don't, and so on. So in order to reduce the imports, other than through a process of where contracts allow you to do that, and we've said that nobody's aware of how this could be done, then you're looking at some sort of a blanket rule, in which case you're talking about 100% gas, ban on gas imports, which obviously we clearly couldn't afford. Even the EU Commission doesn't claim that we can. If we go back, and certainly obviously there have been calls on, well, okay, we'll do it on oil, and maybe on coal, but then how do you do that without there being retaliation from the other side? And if the retaliation from the other side is to say, okay, will you start doing that? Well, we'll just stop all gas. Then we again, this is where the sort of, it's a game of chicken. And then the question is who can play this game, and what impact does it have finally on the economies? Just one other thing. I mean, obviously, another thing to think about all of this in terms of gas and reducing gas imports, whether it's by 2/3 or however much, is this. And the studies done, like, let's say, by the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, is very much a mathematical exercise. So first as I say, you put in the pricing part and you see what actual implications it actually has. Would Europe even afford the rising Asian prices that we would be seeing as a result of us directly competing for significant amounts of LNG gas? And then the other thing that we need to think about is is the demand for Russian gas uniform across the European Union? And the answer is no. There are certain parts of the European Union that are more dependent on gas imports from Russia and piped gas than others, especially Southeast Europe, as as the European Commission knows very well, having done a study on this not so long ago. And so we would be in a situation where countries, for example, like Bosnia, would simply have no gas at all arriving to them. Bulgaria, even if the the interconnector between Bulgaria and Greece was to be completed by October of this year, which we hopefully it will be, but we're still only talking about them being able to get about 1.5 BCM through there. They need another 1.5 BCM from somewhere else. There's Croatia that could potentially simply replace the 1 BCM that it gets of Russian gas from the LNG terminal on Krk, but that would require it to renege on the already on the contracts that it has signed with Hungary to sell 1 BCM of gas via the LNG terminal. It could obviously do so by exercising saying that there's an emergency, but obviously then that would leave Hungary short of 1 BCM. So there are certain parts of the EU that simply cannot wean themselves off Russian gas, certainly not this year. And as the Oxford Institute of Energy Study has shown, even on a mathematical basis, the issue is, even if we were to manage to do it this year, it would be even more difficult to do it next year. So, and obviously these kind of steps are irreversible once they're taken. So going back, and obviously, as we were saying, there is a domino effect, possibility of a domino effect. You cut certain supplies, or you announce cuts in supply demand for gas, that may result in Russia saying, okay, well, we won't supply you with any other things, which obviously doesn't only include fossil fuels. It also will potentially include agricultural products and the rest. So it's our interdependency with Russia is much greater than we would like it to be, and it's not just our interdependency with the Russia. I mean, as we've discovered with Brexit, it's our interdependency generally, how the supply chains and how the economy of the world works. So no one can be an island, at least not at this point.
So if you were to give some advice to the European Commission, what would that be, Anna?
Well, I would simply be saying that we shouldn't be making statements or make scenarios that if they were to happen would have, that we can't live with the consequences of that. So, and I would say that we need to, it's not enough to say mathematically we could potentially reduce our supply by 2/3. We need to know what the consequences of those statements are in terms of what it may, lead the other side to do, and can we afford the response? And have we thought through what that response would be? And more importantly, that the actual are we able to afford it from a point of view of our economies? And I think these are the key things that we need to consider in the cold light of day. Going back to your question on terms of the sanctions, I mean, the sanctions that are now in place obviously provide for a very important exception in terms of which says that whatever is strictly necessary for the purchase, import, or transport of fossil fuels, in particularly coal, oil, and natural gas, but then it lists also titanium, aluminium, copper, nickel, palladium, all of that goes through Russia into the EU is exempt from sanctions. So that's how the trade is able to continue, unless the sanctions that have been, the possibility of new sanctions that have been announced on the 4th of April are followed through, happen. Now, the indirect implication of this is that this exception does not apply to a European company selling oil or gas to a non-European company. So when and let's not forget the sanctions are not entering into force until the 17th of May. So there is still time. But for example, JANAF, which is a Croatian energy company, has announced that unless things change, it will no longer be able to supply oil to Serbia. So even though there is an exemption that would otherwise apply if Serbia was in the EU, since the exception only applies within the EU, for now, as things stands, that agreement would be breached. Or well, not breached. That agreement will not be able to be performed.
So, I mean, if I could just round off, Anna, by saying, so what kind of advice would you give to companies who have contracts, with Russia, either in forms of natural gas or purchasing or oil or coal?
Well, I mean, to the extent that they are considering terminating them, obviously they need to carefully consider if they're able to do so legally, based on their governing law. Obviously, if there is if sanctions are introduced that extend to purchase of gas, then they will have no alternative other than to comply with them. To the extent that the sanctions don't change and they are the way they are now, then companies that are dealing with other energy companies outside the EU will need to be approaching the European Commission to see if, by analogy, those trades are allowed to continue, since if they were in the EU, they would be exempt from sanctions. And these kind of clarifications will need to be given and try to be obtained. But I mean, it's a very difficult situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we'll continue to keep a very close eye on it, all the journalists at Montel News. But in the meantime, Anna, thank you very, very much for joining the Montel Weekly podcast.
You're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
So, listeners, you can now follow the podcast on our own Twitter account, aptly named the Montel Weekly Podcast. Please direct message any suggestions, questions, or let us know if you think you have a good idea for a guest on the show. You can also send us an email to podcast@montelnews.com. Lastly, remember to keep up to date with all that's happening in energy markets on Montel News. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you and goodbye.